Imagine this. You're driving to work, your mind juggling coffee cravings and looming deadlines. Just an hour later, you find yourself in handcuffs, accused of a crime you didn't commit. The judge looks at you like the decision's already been made, and the only thing keeping you afloat is a lawyer who transforms the courtroom into a war zone. But what happened next? No one could have predicted it. Let's rewind to the beginning. Derek Lawson, 29, wasn't the kind of person you'd ever associate with trouble. Born and raised in a modest Chicago neighborhood, he grew up with two strict but loving parents who made sure Derek understood that integrity and hard work were non-negotiable. For him, following the rules wasn't just a choice, it was a way of life. A software engineer by profession, he had a stable job, a spotless record, and a reputation among friends as the fixer, the guy who could solve any problem with ease. So when Derek found himself in the back of a police cruiser, accused of stealing a car, it was nothing short of surreal. This nightmare began one ordinary Tuesday morning. Derek was behind the wheel of a sleek black sedan, borrowed from his friend Marcus, who had lent it to him for a week while Derek's own car was in the shop. For Derek, this was just another favor between friends. Nothing unusual. But as it turned out, that small act of borrowing a car would unravel his life. The day seemed routine until Derek noticed red and blue lights flashing in his rearview mirror. Okay, no big deal, he told himself, pulling over. His heart thudded slightly, but he stayed calm. Maybe a tail light was out, or it was just a routine stop. The officer approached, his boots crunching on the pavement, and tapped on the window with the kind of authority that made Derek's nerves tighten. "License and registration?" the officer demanded, not even bothering to make eye contact as Derek handed over the documents. "Sure, officer. Is there a problem?" Derek asked, keeping his voice steady. The officer barely responded, disappearing back to his cruiser without explanation. Derek sat there, his mind racing. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before the officer returned, this time with backup. Two more officers approached the car, their expressions grim and uncompromising. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," the officer ordered, his voice cold and commanding. Derek blinked, alarmed now. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice edged with unease. "This car matches the description of a stolen vehicle," the officer replied, his tone making it clear he had already decided Derek's guilt. Derek's jaw dropped. "Stolen? That's impossible. This is my friend's car. He lent it to me." "Save it," the cop snapped, grabbing Derek's arm and slapping handcuffs on his wrists with practiced ease. The humiliation hit Derek like a punch. People on the sidewalk slowed down to gawk, their curious stares cutting into him like daggers. He wanted to shout, to explain, but his voice felt trapped in his throat. As the officers led him to the cruiser, he realized the depth of his predicament. No one here cared whether he was innocent. Inside the cramped back seat of the police car, Derek's mind spiraled. How had he ended up here? Borrowing Marcus's car was supposed to be a favor, not the beginning of a nightmare. Hours later, Derek sat in a dimly lit interrogation room, his nerves fraying with every passing second. The officers grilled him relentlessly, their questions circling back to the same accusations. "Why were you driving this car? Did you know it was stolen? Who helped you?" He explained over and over again that Marcus had lent him the car, but his words seemed to bounce off their ears. They didn't want his explanation. They wanted a confession. Derek asked for a lawyer, but none was provided for hours. By the time they finished, he was emotionally drained and teetering on the edge of hopelessness. Meanwhile, the reality of the charges began to sink in. A stolen vehicle? Derek knew Marcus would never report his own car stolen. He'd have no reason to. Something wasn't adding up, but Derek was too exhausted to piece it together. Instead, he was booked, photographed, and sent to a holding cell, where he spent a sleepless night replaying the day's events in his head. The next morning, Derek faced the courtroom for the first time. As he stood before Judge Edward Mallory, a man known for his unforgiving demeanor, it was clear the system had already cast its verdict. The judge eyed Derek like he was nothing more than another name on a long docket of guilty defendants. Well, Mr. Lawson," Mallory said, peering over his glasses. His voice was heavy with sarcasm, his lips curling into a faint smirk. first time in my court? I hope you're enjoying the experience." The room chuckled, and Derek felt a hot flush of anger creep up his neck, but he bit his tongue. Losing his temper here would only make things worse. Mallory continued, waving a folder dramatically. "So, you're telling me you had no idea this car was stolen? How charming. Maybe your lawyer will juggle for us next." The crowd laughed again, and Derek's fists clenched at his sides. His lawyer wasn't even present, delayed by another case, leaving Derek standing alone, an easy target for ridicule. As he stared at the polished wood of the defendant's table, the weight of his situation pressed down on him. How had it come to this? How had the system he trusted turned against him so ruthlessly? Little did Derek know, his story was about to take a turn no one saw coming. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Derek Lawson sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles turned white. The prosecutor smirked from across the room, flipping through a neat stack of papers that he was all too eager to use against Derek. This was no longer just about the accusations. This was about survival. The next day felt like déjà vu, except this time Derek knew he was walking into a war zone. His stomach churned as he took his seat. He didn't even know who his replacement lawyer would be. Would it be some overworked public defender? Someone fresh out of law school? Could they even stand up to the fiery prosecutor who had been tearing him apart with smug confidence the day before? Derek's faith in the system, already hanging by a thread, seemed to snap entirely. The courtroom buzzed like a hive of restless bees. Spectators whispered amongst themselves, trading theories about Derek's guilt. Judge Mallory, with his permanent scowl and thinning hair, sat at his elevated bench, flipping through case files as though he were deciding which book to read next. For Mallory, this wasn't about justice. It was about control. And then the atmosphere shifted. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and in walked Olivia Grant. From the first click of her heels against the marble floor, she commanded attention. Heads turned, whispers stopped, and even the prosecutor's smug grin faltered. Olivia was no ordinary lawyer. At 33, she had already built a reputation for dismantling impossible cases and leaving prosecutors scrambling to pick up the pieces. Dressed in a navy blue power suit that was as sharp as her wit, she carried an aura of unshakable confidence. Her sharp eyes scanned the room, and for a moment, it felt like even Judge Mallory forgot how to breathe. Derek's heart skipped a beat. Who was this woman? How had she ended up here, defending him? He barely had time to process her arrival before Olivia reached the defense table, dropped her leather briefcase onto the wood with a satisfying thud, and pulled out a folder thicker than a dictionary. She gave Derek a brief, reassuring nod. "Don't worry," she whispered, her voice calm but firm. "I've got this." From the moment Olivia spoke, it was clear she wasn't just here to defend Derek. She was here to win. "Your Honor," Olivia began, her voice slicing through the courtroom chatter like a blade. "Before we proceed, I'd like to address some glaring issues with this case, starting with the fact that the charges against my client are based on assumptions, not evidence." The room fell silent. The prosecutor sat up straighter, his smirk replaced by a wary frown. Judge Mallory raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but still skeptical. "Miss Grant," Mallory said, leaning back in his chair, "I suggest you tread carefully. My courtroom runs on facts, not theatrics." Olivia folded her arms, tilting her head slightly as if she were indulging a stubborn child. "Facts, Your Honor? That's interesting, because the so-called facts presented by the prosecution crumble under the slightest scrutiny. Or are we now operating on convenience?" The courtroom gasped. Even Derek, who had spent the last few weeks drowning in despair, couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Olivia wasn't just defending him. She was dismantling the very foundation of the case against him. She began pacing slowly, her heels clicking with a deliberate rhythm. "Let's start with the arrest," she said, flipping through her folder with the precision of a surgeon. The police claimed the vehicle was reported stolen. Yet, the owner of the car, my client's friend, never filed such a report. Curious, isn't it? Almost as if someone jumped to conclusions without verifying basic facts. She turned to the prosecutor, her gaze sharp enough to cut glass. Do we have a formal theft report on record? Or are we relying on hearsay? The prosecutor fumbled for an answer, but Olivia didn't wait. She turned back to the judge, her voice gaining momentum. And then there's the small matter of the interrogation, she continued. My client was questioned for hours without legal representation. He was treated like a criminal before anyone bothered to gather evidence. Your Honor, this is not justice. This is a violation of rights. Judge Mallory opened his mouth to respond, but Olivia wasn't finished. She raised a hand, cutting him off with a gesture so commanding that even he seemed momentarily stunned. Let's talk about evidence, or the lack thereof, she said, holding up a stack of papers. The dashcam footage from the arrest conveniently malfunctioned. Yet, multiple witnesses recorded the incident on their phones. Funny how technology fails at the most opportune moments, isn't it? She placed the papers on the defense table and took a step closer to the jury, her tone shifting from sharp to earnest. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client is not on trial because of evidence. He is here because of assumptions, biases, and a system that failed to do its job. For the first time, the courtroom felt like it was no longer Judge Mallory's domain. It was Olivia's. She owned the room with every word, every gesture, every pointed glance. Derek watched in awe as the tide began to shift. The once confident prosecutor now looked uneasy, flipping through his notes in a desperate attempt to regain control. By the time Olivia finished, the courtroom was silent. Judge Mallory leaned forward, his expression unreadable, but the tension in his posture betrayed his discomfort. Olivia returned to her seat, leaning close to Derek. We're not done yet, she whispered, but we've rattled their cage. For the first time in weeks, Derek felt a glimmer of hope, a feeling he thought he'd lost forever. The fight was far from over, but with Olivia Grant in his corner, it no longer felt unwinnable. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Derek sat at the defense table, his hands clasped together, his nerves frayed but anchored by a single truth. Olivia Grant wasn't just defending him. She was rewriting the narrative. After dismantling the prosecution's shaky evidence, Olivia wasted no time pivoting to the heart of the matter. The next day of the trial, she walked in with the same commanding energy, her sharp navy suit practically gleaming under the courtroom lights. This time, she wasn't just armed with arguments. She had brought proof. Your Honor, Olivia began, her voice steady but electric. Today, we're going to address the real question. Why was my client, a law-abiding citizen, targeted in the first place? The prosecutor frowned, already flipping through his notes, but Olivia didn't falter. She turned to the jury, her gaze piercing. My client was driving a borrowed vehicle, a car that was not reported stolen, and yet, the police claimed it was. Why? She held up a piece of paper. This is a signed affidavit from the car's owner, Marcus Reed, confirming that he lent the car to my client. No theft, no crime. So, I ask you, where did this accusation even come from? The jury leaned forward, and Derek felt a swell of gratitude toward Marcus, who had been working tirelessly to help clear his name. But Olivia wasn't done. She paced the courtroom, her voice rising with intensity. Let's consider the police report. Conveniently vague. No mention of corroborating evidence. No details about how the stolen vehicle alert was triggered. And then there's the dashcam footage. Malfunctioned. She said the word with air quotes, her tone dripping with sarcasm. But here's the kicker, she continued, pulling out another document. We subpoenaed the police department's maintenance records for their dashcams. Do you know what we found? No reported issues with that dashcam before or after the arrest. None. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Judge Mallory banged his gavel. Order, he barked, though his own unease was palpable. Olivia smiled faintly, knowing she had the room's attention. Funny, isn't it? Technology seems to fail only when it's most inconvenient for my client. The prosecutor stood, his voice strained. Objection, Your Honor. Speculation. Overruled, Mallory said reluctantly, waving for Olivia to continue. Thank you, Your Honor, Olivia said smoothly, before turning back to the jury. And let's not forget the eyewitnesses. Multiple people recorded my client's arrest on their phones. Yet, None of this footage was collected or reviewed by the prosecution. Why? Because it contradicts their narrative. These videos show my client cooperating fully, no resistance, no suspicious behavior. Just a man being treated like a criminal without cause. Derek could hardly believe what he was hearing. Olivia wasn't just poking holes in the prosecution's case. She was tearing it apart. The cross-examinations were brutal. Olivia called the arresting officer to the stand, her questions sharp and unrelenting. "Officer Bennett," she began, her tone polite but cutting, "can you explain why my client was arrested without confirmation that the car was actually stolen?" Bennett shifted in his seat, his confidence faltering. "We acted on the information we had at the time," he said vaguely. "Information?" Olivia pressed, raising an eyebrow. "Or assumptions? Did you contact the car's registered owner before making the arrest?" Bennett hesitated. "No, ma'am. But—" "No further questions," Olivia said, cutting him off and turning away, leaving the officer fumbling for words. Next, Olivia called Marcus Reed to the stand. Marcus, dressed in a simple button-down shirt, spoke firmly and clearly. "I never reported my car stolen," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I lent it to Derek while his car was in the shop. I even have text between us confirming this." Olivia held up printed copies of the messages. "Thank you, Mr. Reed. And to clarify, at no point did you give anyone reason to believe your car was stolen?" "Never," Marcus replied. The prosecution tried to recover, but their arguments fell flat. With every witness, every piece of evidence, Olivia unraveled their case further. By the time closing arguments arrived, it was clear where the momentum lay. Olivia stood before the jury, her expression solemn but resolute. This case is not just about Derek Lawson. It's about a system that allowed assumptions to replace facts. It's about a man who was treated as guilty until proven innocent. And it's about whether we, as a society, are willing to accept that. She paused, letting her words sink in. Derek Lawson is not a thief. He is not a criminal. He is a victim of a system that failed him. I ask you to do what the system has not: deliver justice. The jury deliberated for hours, though to Derek it felt like an eternity. When they finally returned, his heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear the foreman speak. "We find the defendant, Derek Lawson, not guilty." Relief washed over Derek like a tidal wave. He slumped back in his chair, tears stinging his eyes. It was over. He was free. Outside the courthouse, Olivia stood with Derek as reporters swarmed them. She answered their questions with the same poise she had displayed in the courtroom, but when the crowd dispersed, she turned to Derek. "You don't need to thank me," she said, cutting him off before he could speak. "This isn't just about you. It's about fixing what's broken." Derek nodded, her words resonating deeply. This victory wasn't just his. It was a crack in the armor of a system that had let too many people down. As Olivia walked away, Derek realized he wasn't just free from the charges. He was free to start over. And this time, he wouldn't take his freedom for granted.